Hello and welcome to GameSack. As you've probably guessed, we're talking about video games based on Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I'm not really into D&D myself, but with me here is Pat, and he's not a gamer, but he knows his D&D.
Well, D&D, Joe, is a game, right?
Yeah, I guess.
That makes me a gamer of sorts, a tabletop gamer.
Fair enough.
I guess you'd say.
Okay.
And a lot of people don't know that video games draw a lot of their nomenclature and concepts from Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons came up with the idea of levels and hit points and experience points that were drawn from earlier war games, but they really kind of gelled in Dungeons & Dragons.
Okay, and there are a ton of video games based on Dungeons & Dragons. We can't cover them all, of course, but we've got a few, so let's just get started. We start off with Dungeons & Dragons: Warriors of the Eternal Sun, a 1992 game from Westwood Associates for the mighty 16-bit Sega Genesis. Basically, your kingdom has been transported to some sort of other world along with goblins and other creatures from D&D, and maybe a few that don't seem to be. Your main goal is to help the kingdom survive, and to do that, you'll need to engage in many turn-based battles like any proper medieval army. You're perfectly free to explore the entire map right from the get-go. You can use a default party or create your own, and even name your 4 members. Sorry, we didn't get very creative. In the immediate vicinity are weapon and armor shops, a magic shop, and a church to heal your party. Wander outside the castle walls, and you're now fair game to all of the creatures lurking about. Battles take place right on the overworld map. It works similar to a strategy RPG game where your character can only move so far in any direction when it's their turn, but there isn't a grid or any highlights to help you see where that is. Most of the characters seem ineffective in battle, though much of this is probably due to me not knowing what the hell I'm doing. It's incredibly easy to die, but fortunately you can save almost anywhere. Your characters don't have a lot of hit points, though I do like the option that lets me see them as number values instead of tiny little life bars. There are actually dungeons to crawl through as well, and when this happens, it switches to a first-person perspective in the upper right corner of the screen. Battles here happen in real time instead of turn-based. In fact, I find that if I equip each of my characters with a sling, I can just rapid fire at the enemies from a distance and go through almost unscathed. Well, that is unless I'm in a dungeon where the monsters are much stronger and significantly outnumber me. The menu system takes a bit to get used to, and I feel it could be laid out better, but it's still functional once you learn where everything is and how you need to deal with it. I feel the presentation of the game is kind of a mixed bag. Back when I first played it in the 90s, I felt the weird angled graphics were incredibly off-putting. They still kind of look weird to me these days, like a satellite photo or something. You ever see a satellite photo where everything's just like oddly angled? But you do get used to them, and once you do, you can most certainly cope. The first-person graphics are incredibly well done, though they are quite small. I like the sound and music here. Each area or part of the map has its own theme that starts playing when you wander into it. Some of the music has some excellent sound quality for the system as well. At the end of the day, I feel this is a pretty good game, though it definitely has a learning curve. I didn't think much of it when I rented it back in the 90s, but I probably only played it for half an hour before giving up, if that. I had even less patience back then. It's definitely an interesting game, even though I would have preferred if the menus and battles were set up more like a JRPG. But how does it feel to someone who's more familiar with D&D than I am? What do you think, Pat?
Well, as a relative outsider to the video game world, my first impressions are of course full of nostalgia for the pixel art style of the game and clunky intro presentation. It's all reminiscent of the first RPGs I played on home computers in the 1980s. As a huge fan of the tabletop version of Dungeons & Dragons, games like this served a special purpose for me, and that was to give me a D&D fix when I was unable to get together with all of my D&D friends in person. This game would have done a good job of that with a lot of familiar D&D imagery and terminology. Going to town to buy weapons and armor, getting injured party members healed up at the local chapel, and then going back out into the wilderness looking for adventure was the archetypal D&D experience. Keep in mind that for a D&D player, this wouldn't have to be a great game, just suggestive enough of D&D to let your imagination work. And again, for that purpose, it seems to do a great job. Joe mentioned the ineffectiveness of the characters in combat, and I should point out that feeling weak and vulnerable as a first-level party was always part of the D&D experience. At first level, one blow from a single goblin could take you out, even as a well-armored fighter. That would make you sweat bullets in combat and be desperate to increase your power by either leveling up or getting better equipment and magic items. In other words, that feeling of impotence was a feature of tabletop D&D and not a bug. Recent editions have vastly changed that, though, making first-level characters as powerful as perhaps third-level characters had been in earlier editions of the game. This Genesis game came out at a weird time for TSR. They had released a second edition of the tabletop game a few years earlier, and it was not performing nearly as well as first edition had. They were reaching a bit, trying to get traction, which makes me wonder if Warriors of the Eternal Sun was something that TSR really got behind, or if it was just a way to make some much-needed money on a quick license deal. But either way, I think it's a winner for D&D fans.
Here's Order of the Griffon, released in 1992 on the TurboGrafx-16 from Westwood Associates. That's right, it's by the same peeps who made Warriors of the Eternal Sun on the Genesis and released in the same year. They went in a slightly different direction with this one. You start out by building your party. We went with a fairly normal fighter, mage, cleric, and thief combo. Can't lose. This one lets you choose from 3 different fighters or members of a certain race or class, each with their own stats. When you begin, you find yourself in a first-person perspective and wander around, but watch out because you can get trapped by enemies in town or even inside buildings. The battles take place in an overhead style similar to a strategy game. It's still pretty clunky, but at least this time you can see how far your character can travel thanks to the map being shaded in areas that are too far for you to move. You and the enemy keep taking turns until the battle is done. Often your attacks will miss, but don't worry too much because the enemy misses a lot as well. Each character can equip 2 different things, and you press button 2 for the left item and button 1 for the right item. Keep in mind that certain characters like the cleric may be required to have something in one of the slots at all times. Once you get out of town, you find yourself walking on an overhead map, 2 abreast. Always. This means that you can't snake through trees because your formation can't change. Battles out here take place in the same manner as they do anywhere else. Once again, the menu system takes some getting used to as I tried to upgrade my fighter's armor, but accidentally dropped them both. That's on me. The game's graphics seem fairly primitive for a console game of the time. In the first-person mode, there's no extra animation when you're moving forward or backwards, you just snap into the new frame and that's all you get. When you turn, the screen will slide to indicate that you turned, which is better than nothing. Interestingly, the game runs at a mixed resolution. The main game runs at 352 pixels wide, while the graphics inside the main window use the normal resolution for the system. The music is fair when it plays. The game's musician, Frank Klepacki, who also worked on the Genesis game Warriors of the Eternal Sun, said that this was the low point in his career because the TurboGrafx-16 sound engine sucked. It's clear that he was having issues because the music often shuts off after your first attack misses. It then stays off for the rest of the entire battle. It definitely helps give the game kind of a buggy feel. This game offers more for you if you put in the patience to learn it, just like real D&D I imagine, but let's face it, the Genesis game blows it away.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing another game made by the same company the same year as Warriors of the Eternal Sun, but for a different console. Order of the Griffon seems to be the weaker of the two on aesthetics, with combat and movement feeling stilted. The first-person navigation of the town is also bland and disorienting compared to the Genesis game's top-down view. But the party-building process at the beginning is better, giving you a chance to assess a variety of character choices based on their ability scores and hit points, all of which is good fun for a tabletop D&D head. The characters are also pre-named, which spares you the tedium of punching in dozens of letters on the controller. In Order of the Griffon, dealing with deceased party members is true to the D&D experience, which calls for you to drag the dead bodies to the nearest chapel and pay through the nose for a high-level priest to cast a raise dead spell. Notably, this game was the first we've seen so far that mentions orcs, which are the bread-and-butter monsters of the D&D world. I can't help but wonder if the other games were trying to steer clear of an IP suit from the Tolkien estate by choosing to leave orcs out.
Okay, 2 down, both by the same developer. Now this next one we're going to look at was technically originally made by that same developer, but the version we're going to look at was actually made in Japan.
Sounds great. Can't wait to see it.
Alright, here's Eye of the Beholder on the Sega CD. This is also on the Super Famicom and many different computers. I was always interested in this particular version back in the 90s because I had heard that Yuzo Koshiro did the music for it. The game itself is a pure dungeon crawler and nothing else. You can either have the game create a party for you, or you can create your own. It then begins with a slightly animated intro detailing the story. Then you find yourself trapped in the dungeon and left to your own devices. You can use the controller or the mouse. Even the Japanese Mega Mouse will work fine in Port 2. We started out using the controller and it was clunky but doable. I tried it again with the mouse, and honestly this is how the game is meant to be played, as everything is designed around a point and click interface. To move or turn, you need to click on a direction in the lower left. You can also click on things in the action screen to take items, pull levers, press buttons, or things like that. To fight, you hover your mouse over the weapon that you'd like your character to use and press B or the right mouse button. After that, there will be a short downtime before that character can act again. Certain characters in the back won't be able to reach with melee weapons, which is a lesson I learned almost right away. Unfortunately, you don't seem to be able to change their order after the party is already created, which is unfortunate. I already said unfortunately, but you get the idea. It's unfortunate. It's double unfortunate. You also need to take advantage of the map once you find it. This is definitely the deepest D&D experience in a video game I've personally experienced yet. The graphics in the game are great, but unfortunately it's pretty herky-jerky, and I feel there could be a lot more fluidity in the game's movements, especially when turning. Yes, there is a compass that tells you exactly what's going on, but you need to keep in mind my limited brain capacity. I need immediate visual cues. The monsters look good though, and from what I've seen, they're all represented well here. You can hear nearby monsters shuffling around, even behind doors, so you're aware that you should tread carefully. When you think Dungeons & Dragons, you think dance music, and this game gives you exactly what you demand. Yuzo Koshiro did a great job with his first CD game soundtrack. As a video game, it's clunky without a mouse, so I definitely recommend one if you can. I found myself enjoying this a lot more than I thought I would once I did play with a mouse. The puzzles in the game can be both tricky and fun, and you'll also have to use your brain in some spots. Please refer back to what I said earlier about my brain capacity. That is, if yours allows you to remember that far back. I think that people who enjoy PC dungeon crawlers will really enjoy this one.
This is the first game we've seen so far that really gets me excited as an old school D&D player. It's packed with features that come directly from the tabletop game, allowing you to manage your resources and strategize using all of your D&D knowledge and experience. Character generation is by way of random die rolls, just like in D&D, but you can also customize your ability scores to recreate your favorite tabletop characters. Your characters can be any race, alignment, or character class, and this game even offers multi-class as an option, which is huge for anyone who played early editions of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I love Eye of the Beholder's loadout map showing where on your body you're carrying your equipment, and it becomes a mini strategy game of its own, deciding what items you want to have ready in hand when going into an encounter. Eye of the Beholder's manual reads like a mini version of D&D's hardcover rulebooks, detailing races, classes, monsters, different actions you can take, and tables for level progression. I like the appearance of the game too, in terms of how mossy the stone dungeon interior looks and how the monsters are depicted. I'm not a retro video game connoisseur, but as a huge fan of old school D&D, I really find myself wanting to own and play Eye of the Beholder at home. The developers of this game must have worked very closely with TSR's design team to make it so faithful to D&D's tabletop roots. Dungeons & Dragons Collection came to the Saturn only in Japan in 1999.
Comprising of two games, Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara, these are both hack-and-slash beat-em-up style games. Both games were first released in the arcades. Tower of Doom came out there in 1994. This one allows 4 players simultaneously in the arcade, but only 2 players on the Saturn. I'm fine with that, as I can only imagine how crowded the screen would get with 4 players and enough enemies for all of them. The chaos might be fun though. You can choose from 4 different characters: the fighter, the cleric, the elf, and the dwarf. Of course, each has their own strengths and weaknesses, and if you know anything about Dungeons & Dragons, you know I'm wasting my breath by telling you that. I tend to choose the fighter since he's the most generic, much like myself. You can jump with one button and melee attack with another. A third button tosses a projectile weapon like a knife, arrow, or Molotov cocktail, which is known here as oil. The fourth button allows you to select between your different projectile weapons if you have different kinds in stock. It's all quite responsive. Since I'm playing the Saturn version, much of it is in Japanese, such as your weapons at the bottom of the screen. There are also short conversations that happen in Japanese. However, sometimes you're asked to make a choice and I end up having to guess. Not that any of it really matters much, as you're treated to awesome action going forward no matter what. Between stages, you can even buy more projectile weapons or restore some of your life. The graphics in Tower of Doom are very well done. I would expect no less of a Capcom arcade game from this time period. But the fact that they're done well enough for Pat to recognize what most of these enemies are before their life bars appear on screen as he watched me play says a lot how they tried to stick true to the D&D world. The animation seems pretty well done and quite faithful to the arcade as well. At one point, however, I was wondering where to go to progress through the stage. It turns out that I had to walk through this wall for the stage to end. The sound and music are typical for a Capcom arcade game of the time. It's loud, designed to attract people to the cabinet to see what all the fuss is about. It all fits quite well with the game. Overall, this one is a ton of fun.
Indeed, this game has a number of cool features for a D&D fan. First of all, it's always fun seeing the names of monsters that you recognize, like kobolds, ogres, gnolls, trolls, and troglodytes. And the visual depictions are also pretty true to the D&D monster manual. You have to remember that when you've spent years playing Dungeons & Dragons, these monster names bring with them a long history of associations. So in some ways it's like seeing an old friend and gives you an immediate connection to the game world. Tower of Doom also does a good job of incorporating the special abilities of D&D monsters into the game. Trolls regenerate after you kill them and will come back to life unless their bodies are burned. Ghouls not only do damage with their claws, but their strikes also cause paralysis. These design concepts allow a D&D aficionado to play smart, just as they would in a tabletop session, using their knowledge of the D&D universe to survive where a novice player might not. Since the game is action-oriented, it doesn't really give you the feel of a D&D campaign. A good tabletop D&D session usually includes a more textured story experience, including non-combat exploration, interesting NPCs who populate the world, and a sense of purpose to the adventure. While Tower of Doom is fun, it focuses pretty narrowly on the combat aspect of D&D. There are also some odd creative choices. The pixie who guides your party from screen to screen seems more like a Peter Pan reference than a D&D one. And the monsters seem to keep odd company. Usually you wouldn't expect kobolds and gnolls to be hanging out with skeletons and ghouls unless there's an evil cleric present. Overall, I think Tower of Doom succeeds at creating a beat-em-up arcade experience in the D&D universe. Incidentally, the game also poses a bizarre trivia question for me, because the voice that says Dungeons & Dragons on the intro screen sounds uncannily like former Wizards of the Coast CEO Peter Adkison.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Shadow over Mystara is also included in the Dungeons & Dragons collection. I think I already said that, but I'm leaving it in. This one came to the arcades first in 1996. This, of course, is another hack-and-slash beat-em-up very similar to Tower of Doom. But now, there are 6 characters to choose from instead of just 4. Also, 2 players can pick the same class of character, which wasn't allowed in Tower of Doom. The basic action itself remains largely similar, using melee attacks and jumping. You can also use a special attack if you have enough life remaining, and some special moves have been added. Your sub-weapons have been reworked. Now, pressing the X button brings up a ring around your character, which allows you to select from different items and then use them with the C button. For example, you can choose the arrow to shoot the arrows until you run out or select something else. If you select the shield, pressing C will raise your shield if your character can use one. The thief and magic user can't use a shield. Once again, there are text and cutscenes between most of the levels with the occasional choice you need to make. One thing you should know is that this one requires the 4MB RAM expansion cartridge for the Saturn. The initial load time is pretty long. The loads between different levels seem normal though. But if you die, continue, and choose a different character, the game will have to load that character even in single player mode. It does kind of drag the action down a bit. The presentation of this game reminds me a bit more of Sega's Golden Axe, with villagers fleeing the marauding bad guys and whatnot. Play as the dwarf for the ultimate, not quite but still kinda Golden Axe experience. The graphics are on par with Tower of Doom. The artwork is all very similar, and of course that means it's quite good in this one as well. There are of course some new enemies and creatures, but there are a lot of returning assets from the old game as well. I would have liked to see more new things. A few of the stages are rather repetitive, like this one where we fight on the back of a moving cart. It keeps going and going, kind of artificially adding length to the stage and the game itself. This is definitely the more advanced game in the collection. I just wish they had optimized it a bit more so the load times wouldn't be so intrusive. Still, don't get me wrong, this is definitely a good one.
Shadow over Mystara makes more of an effort than its predecessor in giving story context to the battles, which brings it more in line with the tabletop D&D experience. On the first screen, your character is protecting a village from being overrun by goblins, and simple cutscenes after that outline your missions for you, although you can't follow along on the Saturn unless you can read Japanese. The combat action does get a little zany, which often takes me out of the Dungeons & Dragons feel. At one point, your character finds himself on what looks like a medieval flatbed train car fighting a giant demon called Dark Warrior 1, which left me thinking, what is this even supposed to be? As with Tower of Doom, you get to see a lot of classic D&D monsters, including awesome depictions of a manticore and a beholder. The beholder is one of the most fearsome opponents in tabletop D&D, and it was very satisfying seeing one in action in this game. Overall, it seems like the game tries too hard to be action-packed to keep the base level of fantasy realism you see in tabletop D&D. Fighting goblins with your sword feels grounded, but dodging a spiked goblin war machine that zips back and forth across the screen feels too cartoonish for me to stay invested in it as a D&D experience. At that point, it's just a game of reflexes, and any real connection between me and the character is lost. That connection is the essence of D&D.
Alright, we've got 3 more games to show you today. Pat, are you ready to throw away your die and only play video game versions of D&D?
I'm never gonna throw away my dice.
Well, this next one is not going to convince you either. Let's check out Heroes of the Lance on the Sega Master System from US Gold, released in 1991. This was only released in Europe, and it was developed by Tiertex, who has a reputation for bringing many tears with the awful games that they make. This is a side-scrolling game, and you have 8 characters. You have a front 4 and a back 4. The top leftmost character is who you control. You slowly walk left or right. When the compass lights up, you can press up or down to go in that direction. Button 2 brings up a menu that will let you change the order of your characters, take items from treasure chests, use spells, and things of that nature. You can't use magic or clerical staff spells unless Raceland and Gold Moon are in your front 4. Gold Moon has the blue crystal staff, which you'll need to beat the game, so you need to keep her alive at all costs. This is much easier said than done. Holding the 1 button will attack. You can't just tap it like you would with a normal game, because of course not. Once the character you're using dies, the next one behind them automatically appears and takes over. Navigating the game will take some time to learn, especially since much of it looks very similar. Graphically, it's substandard, even for the Master System, and there really isn't much positive to say about it. There is a musical ditty in the background, which ends up being kind of annoying. This game is also on the NES, and it was released by FCI. The gameplay here is largely the same. The graphics are a bit smaller and more washed out, but the sound is better, definitely less shrill and annoying. Still, it's not a great game by any means though. I will admit though that I always loved the artwork on this box. In fact, I drew my own version of the dragon when I was in high school because I thought it looked so damn cool. And I still think that. I got rid of this guy though. Nobody likes him. I doubt he has any friends. Honest opinion, what do you think of my drawing? Do you think it's worthy of the game soundtrack that you're listening to right now? As a video game, this is all sorts of awful. I've always wondered if the designers at Tier Text have actually played video games before. Surely these guys excel at developing accounting software or something because that's about as fun as this game is.
Heroes of the Lance is a light D&D flavored adventure with some familiar character classes and spells, among other nomenclature. The party comprises 8 characters, all of whom have names and a paragraph of background provided by the game. I noticed 2 of the characters, Flint and Sturm, appear to be named after TSR employees, game designer Flint Dilley and corporate counsel Dieter Sturm. The characters explore the dungeon and fight monsters one at a time, each character stepping in as soon as the one before them dies. This creates something of a strategy puzzle for the player, not unlike assembling the batting order of a baseball team. In addition to fighting monsters, the characters face the perils of pit traps and slabs of rock falling from the ceiling. The D&D connections are too tenuous for me to get excited about Heroes of the Lance purely as an enthusiast of Dungeons & Dragons, but the nostalgia factor is high nonetheless.
Now let's take a look at Forgotten Realms' Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. This was originally available for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, and even the Game Boy Advance.
Welcome, friend.
It's since been re-released on a ton of modern platforms. This is the original Xbox version here. You begin by choosing one of 3 characters, a human archer, a dwarven fighter, or an elven sorceress. We chose the human. This game features 2-player co-op, but with Pat not being a seasoned video gamer, it was thought best that I travel alone. That way I could play and he could observe the D&D-ness. At the start, you arrive in town and get your stuff stolen. Now you're hell-bent on your mission to get your stuff back and make those thieves pay. You talk to the owner of the inn who keeps gyrating her hips at you. You have multiple choice answers, but they all eventually lead to the same result. But if you like, you can take the time to lead the conversation in a way to learn more about the world. Next thing you know, you're fighting rats. The game is basically a hack and slash adventure. As you beat them, you collect gold, potions, weapons, and armor. Seriously, less than 10 minutes down here, I think you've acquired way more than you arrived in town with and got stolen from you, but you still need to make those thieves suffer. You can attack, jump, and use potions with the triggers. Magic users will also experience the joy of the B button. You can cycle through weapons and items with the D-pad once you equip them. When you gain enough experience, you can spend some points to level up individual attributes and powers. You regain HP automatically when you're not engaged in battle. It's slow, but it happens if you're patient. Sometimes the only way to take down a massive amount of enemies is to kill a couple, run away until you're healed, and then come back and kill a few more. Wash, rinse, and repeat. The enemies are absolutely everywhere, and you'll often find yourself overwhelmed, so be careful. Fortunately, there are a fairly generous amount of save points to continue from. Graphically, the game is sharp and the details are all quite nice. It runs in 480p, but not in widescreen. I think my biggest complaint about the graphics is how small everything is. I really want to see more of the details of my enemies. This isn't a big complaint though. The audio is fairly typical for such a game, with lots of sounds coming from the enemies letting you know when they're around. There's some music here, and again, it's typical, and it certainly fits. This is a fun game for sure. I like trying to make it to the next save point. It does start to get a bit repetitive in spots though.
The Dungeons & Dragons feeling is definitely less in a modern hack-and-slash video game format, but I did like that the scenes are set for you by an omniscient narrator.
You are weary from your travels, but mesmerized at the sight of Baldur's Gate. It is night as you enter the city, and it seems strangely deserted.
In tabletop D&D, it is the Dungeon Master who provides that narrative description of your environment, and it's a staple of the game. Also, the overhead 3D view and the small physical scale of the characters is suggestive of painted miniatures and a tabletop dungeon. There's a company called Dwarven Forge that makes 3D dungeon mazes for use with D&D miniatures, and they look a lot like what you see on the screen in Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. As a D&D player, I recognized what appear to be kobolds and a bugbear, and they had a taxidermized beholder on the mantle of the tavern where you start your adventure. The point system for acquiring feats is also consistent with the 3rd edition D&D rules that were released by Wizards of the Coast around the time this game came out. Overall, the Dungeons & Dragons DNA isn't there for me on this one. In fairness, it's possible that when facing higher-level monsters, D&D canon could become more evident in gameplay. It's also possible that my strong bias for 1st edition D&D makes later edition references less nostalgic for me.
Lastly, we have Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, which came to the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. You can also get it on Steam these days. Again, this is the Xbox version here. This one gives me a lot of Lord of the Ring vibes, but I guess that's something that just can't be avoided with the subject matter. This one lets you choose from 5 characters instead of 3. A human barbarian, a dark elf monk, a moon elf necromancer, a dwarven rogue, and a human cleric. We chose the cleric this time. Probably not our wisest decision retrospectively. Once again, you can play with 2 players if you like. This game is presented pretty much the same way as the first, with the overhead view, the controls, and whatnot. Most of the menus are the same, but some have been changed slightly. Using the cleric, I quickly found myself struggling against the constant onslaught of enemies. I did like how she was able to use her magic to heal in an almost unlimited capacity, but it takes a small amount of time to recharge, so it's not like an invincible mode or anything. Using her other spells to increase my attack strength for 35 seconds didn't seem to make a noticeable difference. It would probably be more effective if I used it to increase another character's strength for 35 seconds. Eventually, I found myself simply running for my life as that was more effective than fighting. Doesn't do much for leveling up though. One new thing that I like is that you can now tap on the right analog stick to get a slightly closer view. Everything is still pretty small though. Graphically, the game is about the same quality as the first one, certainly not bad. They were going to make a 3rd game, but that never ended up happening.
I'll definitely say that it was cool seeing the addition of the monk and the barbarian classes made available in Dark Alliance 2, and the outdoor scenery certainly looks great. But where both editions of Baldur's Gate are concerned, I think what really loses me as a D&D fan is the character hit points that regenerate in real time. I understand how that makes an action game more enjoyable, but the management of finite resources like hit points and spells is a huge part of Dungeons & Dragons from a game theory standpoint. In the absence of that, a game can still be fun, but it becomes something else.
And there you go, a handful of video games based on Dungeons & Dragons. Pat, out of the ones we looked at today, what would you say was your favorite?
Joe, I would say far and away, Eye of the Beholder was my favorite. It was like playing real Dungeons & Dragons, just with a light version of the rules. So if ever I had the itch to play and couldn't get together with my friends, Eye of the Beholder is what I would reach for. How about you?
I'm going to have to go with the Capcom games, the Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara, because I like me a good beat 'em up. I don't care if it has to do with Dungeons & Dragons, although that is cool. Those are just the ones I like playing the most as video games. Anyway, what is your favorite video game based on Dungeons & Dragons? Let us know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack.
have entered a chamber, 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, with an L-shaped bend off to the northeast. Disturbing pagan reliefs are sculpted into the walls, and a blood-red marble altar is perched on a dais 30 feet from you. As your torchlight flickers upon this fell, unholy place, a creature rises from behind the altar. The 6,000-pound beast has the head of a rat and a long, narrow body with 12 legs. It has black eyes with no pupils. It opens its mouth and lets out a blood-curdling shriek that rattles the walls around you. What do you do?
I tell you what I do. I'm gonna do a super...
No. You can't use your controller.
I am controlling my party, am I not?
Well, yeah, but you control it with your mind, with your imagination.
You're telling me that this is all I have to work with when it comes to the graphics in this?
Well, yeah, but only technically. I mean, that's just the starting point. That's the jumping off point for your imagination. Kind of like the grain of sand that the pearl is formed around. You know, this is theater of the mind. The world cannot all be depicted for you on your screen, Joe.
You know who says that? People who can't do good graphics.
Really. 40 million people play this game worldwide. 40 million people are buying stacks of hardcover books, dice, miniatures, fancy Dungeon Master screens. This is a worldwide phenomenon, Joe. Are they all wrong? And Joe's right?
40 million people, huh? All of whom have low expectations. Well, I like money, and I do not like putting effort into things. All right, Pat, what do you think of my game? You think the rubes will buy it?
What exactly is happening on the screen? It's like I'm not even sure what I'm looking at right now.
Oh, come on, Pat. Use your imagination.
Seriously, though, that's just like a square. I think I better be going.